German field fortifications 1939–45. While the German Army Deutschen here is perhaps best known for elaborate, massive concrete and steel fortifications, such as the West Wall or Siegfried Line, an Atlantic Wall, the fortifications that a German soldier was most familiar with were the ones he dug himself. Whether built on the sprawling steppes of Russia, in the deserts of North Africa, in the mountains of Italy, in European hills, in forests, or among the rubble of countless battered cities, these were the fortifications that truly defined the boundaries of the Third Reich. The focus of this study is the field fortifications constructed by combat troops defending the front line. Large, permanent fortifications are beyond the scope of this book and are dealt with in accompanying fortress titles such as Fortress 15, Germany's West Wall. The core focus will be temporary and semi-permanent crew-served weapon positions and individual and small units, fighting positions, built with local materials and occasionally construction material. Little engineer support was provided. Pioneer troops may have provided advice, but the infantry mostly built these positions and obstacles. However, pioneer, and construction, but pioneer units and organization, TOD, civilian laborers, did sometimes prepare defenses behind front four units to fall back to. While wartime intelligence studies and reports provide detailed information on German field defenses, only limited post-war study has been undertaken. This is largely due to their temporary nature, and the fact that little survives of them today. The Wehrmacht, consisting of the Heer, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine, used the same basic doctrine and manuals for positioning and construction purposes as did the Waffen-SS. With the exception of local improvisation, a factor common to all armies in the field, all branches of the UHL. German armed forces employed these field fortifications and obstacles. German tactical defense doctrine, elastic defense. The experiences on the Western Front during World War I had a strong influence, both negative and positive, on post-war defense doctrine. The positive aspect of World War I to the Germans from the doctrinal standpoint was the development of what is informally known as the elastic defense, Elastische Kampfverfahren, literally elastic battle procedures. By 1916, it had been realized that solid multi-layered trench systems and an unyielding defense aimed at holding on to every meter of ground were impractical. Massive six-day artillery barrages would shatter defenses and the defenders. General of Infantry Erich Ludendorff endorsed a more in-depth defense. While still relying on continuous, interconnected trench lines, the defenses were subdivided into 3 zones. 1 combat outpost zone with minimal lookouts to warn of attacks and keep patrols from penetrating deeper, to 1,500 to 3,000 meters deep main battle zone, with complex trench systems concentrated on key terrain rather than rigid lines, covering all areas intended to halt the attack, and 3 rear zone with artillery and reserves. While the battle zones still relied on trench lines to establish the new defenses, the Germans actually withdrew, previously unheard of in some sectors. 2 more easily defended terrain, placed many of the trenches on reverse slopes to mask them from enemy observation and fire, and established strong points on key terrain. The establishment of the combat zone, supported by long range, disrupted Allied attacks. After fighting its way through the outpost zone, the attack would often exhaust itself in the battle zone. Rather than attempting to halt the attack outright, penetration of the battle zone was accepted. The attack would become bogged down among the defenses, battered by artillery fire, counterattacks. This was first implemented in April 1917 and by war's end. In November 1918, the defenses were completely rearranged under this concept. It had proved itself and was adopted by the post-war Reichswehr in 1921. Mobile warfare. There were negative influences too of the experiences on the Western Front. The horror, misery, and prolonged stalemate of trench or positional warfare Stellungskrieg encouraged. Many, like Hans von Seeck, to find another way to wage war. Some form of mobile offensive was preferred, and defense was regarded as necessary only for local holding actions or a temporary situation until the initiative was regained and the offensive resumed. The elastic defense was codified in the 2-volume manual Kollidfrung and Gefecht der Verbundenen. Waffen Leadership and Combat oft Combined Arms, published in 1921-23. This codification managed a compromise between those who still favored the elastic defense, the old trench school, and those espousing a more mobile form of warfare. The manual stated that either form of warfare could be employed depending on the situation, but it clearly preferred the elastic defense with improvements. These entailed more depth both within each zone and in the distances between zones, and in fluid situations, it called for a fourth zone, forward of the 3 traditional ones. This was an advanced position of light mobile units, infantry and artillery, which would disrupt the attack and force the enemy to deploy early into battle formation. The advance units would then withdraw and constitute part of the reserve. Anti-armor defense was addressed, but there were few effective anti-armor weapons at the end. Anti-armor being prohibited for the Reichsheer. This took the form of artillery, concentrations and obstacles. The combat outpost zone would consist only of individual and infantry weapon positions not connected by trenches. Such was the theory. In practice, Colonel General Hans von Seeckt, acting Chief of Staff, strongly discouraged any officer with some being relieved of duty from practicing the elastic defense. Seeckt desired a mobile war of maneuver and shunned defense. Though Seeckt resigned in 1926, his successors continued to abide by his views, which remained in effect until the early 1930s. The practice of the elastic defense was permitted in exercises. The rearmament of Germany in 1933 gradually saw the means become available to practice a highly evolved form of mobile warfare. This was by no means army-wide, as the new Deutschen Heer was still largely an infantry force, relying on horse artillery and horse-drawn supply columns, 4,000 to 6,000 horses per division. The infantry division's 27 rifle companies may have walked, but the division did possess a degree of mechanization via truck transport for headquarters, signal, anti-armor, and pioneer elements. Divisional reconnaissance battalions, too, were increasingly mechanized, receiving motorcycles and scout cars, though horses and bicycles were still relied on. The new defense doctrine, laid out in Truppenfrung Troop Command in 1933, allowed the 4 previous zones a greater use of anti-armor obstacles. Minefields, anti-armor guns behind the main battle position, and tanks assembled in the rear zone to support counterattacks. Use of armor as a mobile counterattack and maneuver. Force was not fully appreciated at this time, though, as German tanks had played no role in defeating Allied tank breakthroughs in World War I. They would be held in the rear to engage enemy tanks that had broken through and to destroy them piecemeal as they wandered through the rear zone. There was disagreement on the employment of anti-armor guns. While some might be attached to the advanced position forces, most were to be positioned behind the main battle position to block tank breakthroughs. Others urged that they be positioned forward to pick off approaching enemy armor and break up the attack early. Individual infantrymen were to attack roaming tanks with anti-armor rifles and handmines, which proved to be inadequate. As the Blitzkrieg lightning war concept developed, the German army became so offensively orientated that anything appearing to defensive in nature was at risk of being minimized. Anti-armor gun Panzerabwehr units were redesignated armor-hunting Panzerger units on the 1st of April. 1940 anti-armor guns were still called Panzerabwehrknorrpack, for short. In the first 2 years of World War II, German defensive doctrine was of secondary importance. Units did, of course, assume defensive postures locally as the operational situation required. General defensive situations for large formations were, for the most part, unnecessary. While units developed coastal defenses and the Afri Corps was forced on the defensive at times, there was no major test of Germany's World War I elastic defense legacy. This would change in the winter of 1941. The broad expanses of the USSR, the necessity of defending on wide fronts, the decline in manpower, the loss of critical weapons and equipment, the massing of Soviet infantry, armor and artillery, and the terrain and weather themselves forced revisions in defensive doctrine. Other theaters of war, particularly North Africa and Italy, demanded additional changes and considerations. Eventually, soldiers fighting on different fronts would employ unique defensive tactics and adapt their fighting positions to local conditions. The principles of unit defense, regardless of the unique aspects of any given front, at all unit levels defined by the Germans as regimental level and below common principles for the establishment and conduct of defense were employed down to the squad. Space, distances, density of forces, and support would vary though, as would construction materials, types of fortifications, obstacles, and how they were deployed and manned. High ground was always desirable for defensive positions for its observation, its advantages, extended fields of fire, and the fact that it is harder to fight uphill. In the desert, even an elevation of a couple of meters would be an advantage. Natural terrain obstacles were integrated into the defense as much as possible. The routes and directions of possible enemy attacks were determined, and infantry and supporting weapons were designated to cover these approaches. The goal was to destroy or disrupt the attackers by concentrating all available weapons before the enemy reached the main battle position. Effective employment of the different weapons organic to an infantry regiment was an art in itself, as each had capabilities and limitations. The weapons comprised light and heavy machine guns, anti-armor rifles, mortars, infantry guns, anti-armor guns, and supporting artillery to include anti-aircraft guns, deployed in a ground role. A commander preparing a defense and an attack needed to identify the main effort point, Schwerpunkt. In attack, this was the point at which he would concentrate effort and firepower to break through the enemy defenses. In defense, this was the point assessed by the defending commander where the enemy would attempt to break through. He would concentrate his defenses, supporting weapons there. The defense would be established in depth, but not just using the 4 zones. Each zone in itself would be organized in depth, with the weapons providing mutual cover for each other. The employment of obstacles and minefields was critical, as it was fully understood that anti-armor weapons alone could not halt attacking tanks. Tank hunting. Detachments with anti-armor rifles and hand mines were organized. In 1943, Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck shoulder-fired anti-armor rocket launchers began to replace these. As the war progressed, anti-armor guns were increasingly employed in the main battle positions as well as in forward and outpost positions. Armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, tanks, and assault guns tended to be held as mobile reserves to counterattack. Breakthroughs. There were many instances, though, where AFVs were employed as mobile pillboxes. As Germany lost ever more AFVs and infantry units were reduced in strength, the availability of mobile reserves dwindled. Rather than large units conducting major counterattacks, they became increasingly localized and smaller, greatly reducing the German ability to regain lost ground. Because of the extensive defensive frontages often acquired, strong point defense was adopted on many fronts. There were no continuous front lines. The gaps between mutually supporting strong points were extensive to be covered by outposts, patrols, and observation, backed up by long-range fire. This reduced the numbers of troops necessary to defend an area, but not necessarily the number of weapons. Strong points had to be well armed with the full range of weapons. Strong mobile reserves were a necessity. Still, the basic German doctrine of 4 defensive zones was retained to provide depth to the defense. Camouflage efforts and all-round local security were continuous during the development of defensive positions. Camouflage had to prevent the enemy from detecting positions from the ground and the air. Reconnaissance forward of the defensive zones was essential to warn of the enemy's approach and his activities. The Germans developed a good capability of determining when and where the enemy might attack. By closely watching for signs of offensive action, a wide variety of anti-personnel and anti-armor obstacles were employed. Maximum use was made of local and impounded materials. While it was difficult to conceal obstacles, the Germans would emplace barbed wire barriers along natural contour lines, on low ground, on reverse slopes, hinterhang, along the edge of fields, and within vegetation. Terrain was important. Swamps, marshes, forests, rivers, streams, gullies, ravines, broken and extremely rocky ground. Now halted or slowed tanks. They fully understood that to be effective, an obstacle had to be covered both by observation and fire. Planning the defenses. Manuals provided standardized designs for field fortifications, but there were many variations and exceptions in the field. This was caused by the need to blend the fortification into the terrain, thus modifying its size, shape, and profile. Locally standardized designs induced by material shortages, types of material available, terrain conditions, weather, time constraints, preferences and concepts of local commanders, and the ingenuity and imagination of the officers and NCOs supervising construction. Many of the positions and structures specified in manuals were quite elaborate, though these tended to be the ideal standard. Dimensions, even of positions housing the same type of weapon, could vary. A common basic design can be seen in many examples. How establishing a defended area. Unit was assigned an area to defend based on terrain, vegetation, enemy. Forces, unit capabilities, most would be under strength and short of some. Crew served weapons and availability of reserves and supporting fire. Depth and frontage. Infantry unit frontages could vary greatly. See Table 1. A major factor affecting the width of a division sector was its internal organization. Standard. German infantry divisions had 3 infantry grenadier regiments with 3 battalions each. On the 15th of October 1942, all regiments and smaller units designated infantry were redesignated grenadier for morale purposes. This allowed for the standard to up and one back formation, that is, 2 subunits of any given unit were deployed in the main battle line with one behind them, in reserve. From late 1943, due to manpower shortages, most infantry divisions were reorganized with only 2 battalions per regiment, and the reconnaissance battalion, off Coal Rings of Toulon, was converted to a Fusilier Bataillon as a mobile reserve. The Germans employed 2 terms for battalion. Bataillon was used by infantry and pioneer battalions, and Abteilung, or subdivision, was used by armor, artillery, smoke, cavalry, and other branches. This required regiments to place both battalions in the line without a reserve, although a company may have been retained as a regimental reserve. However, this meant that one of the SHE battalions was without a reserve. After all 3 regiments had to be in the line, with only the Fusilier battalion as the divisional reserve. In 1942, planning the defenses combat, depleted divisions consolidated their menace of their reconnaissance and anti-armor battalions into a single unit to serve as a mobile reserve Panzerger and Aufklärungsabteil. The separate battalions were later reconstituted. It was common for the only effective mobile reserve to be found at corps or army level. Mountaingebirges and light infantry Jäger divisions had only 2 regiments with 3 battalions because they were expected to fight on rough terrain with narrow frontages. The 700 series occupation divisions raised in 1941 also had only 2 regiments and a single artillery battalion. Both these divisional structures, 3 2-battalion regiments and 2 3-battalion regiments, greatly reduced a division's ability to defend in depth and field a viable reserve. The depth of each of the positions depended much on the terrain and likely avenues of enemy approach. There was no specified depth. Depth would be achieved by not only positioning the 2 subunits forward and the reserve subunit to the rear for each unit, but elements of each subunit might be deployed in depth within the position, providing mutual support and protecting the flanks. Various crew-served weapons attached from higher formations added to the width and depth of positions as well. The main battle line. The main battle line, Hauptkampflinie, analogous to the U.S. main line of resistance, was determined by the commander using map reconnaissance. Subordinate unit commanders then reconnoitered the ground and moved their units into position. Commanders were cautioned not to spend too much time on reconnaissance so as not to delay construction of defenses. They designated their subunits area, primary sectors of fire, locations of support weapons, obstacles, minefields, command posts, aid stations, ammunition, and supply points, and so on. The higher commander might specify the locations and sectors of fire of crew-served weapons allocated from higher formations in order to ensure their integration into the overall defense plan. Artillery. Infantry gun and mortar fire support plans were developed. Reserve positions were established and counterattack plans made. The advanced position Vorgeschobenstellen was established 4,500 to 6,500 meters forward of the main battle line. It would be manned by reconnaissance troops, detachments from reserve units, and anti-armor and machine gun. Artillery forward observers would be located there, and the approaches forward of the position, or within range of medium artillery 15 centimeters. These could be employed to break up any attack. The forces were widely scattered and in shallow depth. Small troop elements covered the roads, trails, and railways approaching the position, plus crossroads, river crossings, and key terrain such as high ground. They warned of enemy attack, prevented patrols from penetrating into the main defenses, attempted to force the enemy to deploy early, and called for fire on the enemy. The troops manning the advanced position would withdraw using concealed routes before they became too committed. The advanced position was not employed if the front was stabilized, that is, if enemy forces were in established positions or in close proximity to the German line. Combat outposts. The combat outposts Gefechtsvorpoint were 2,000 to 4,500 meters forward of the main battle line. While similar in concept to the U.S. combat outpost line, they were often better manned. This sector had much the same mission as the advanced position, but might be more heavily armed and manned in stronger positions. It could mislead the enemy as to the location of the main battle line. Dummy positions might be constructed for this purpose. Obstacles and minefields were placed on avenues of approach and covered by fire. The combat outposts were within light artillery 10.5 centimeters range, and forward observers from the howitzer batteries were located in these positions. Villages, tree lines and clumps, and hills covering the avenues of approach were developed as strong points. The Germans fully realized that enemy infantry would more than likely advance through woods and other terrain offering concealment redurthen in the open, and so such areas were covered by reconnaissance patrols, Speichertrupp, outposts, Vorposten, outpost, vault walk, observation posts, Beobachtung, listening posts, Horkstol and fire. The same types of units manning the advanced position, especially if it was not employed, manned the combat outpost position, platoons. And companies from the reserve regiment held the strong points here. They could also execute small-scale limited objective attacks to delay any enemy advance. The outposts were abandoned on order or when in danger of being overrun. Concealed withdrawal routes were selected so as not to interfere with covering.
Artillery fire.
Artillery and mortar fire was often registered on the forward positions to delay the enemy and cover the withdrawal. Artillery was usually placed approximately 1/3 of its maximum effective range behind the main battle line. The main battlefield. The main battlefield Hauptkampfeld concentrated the bulk of the infantry and their supporting weapons on dominating terrain features or terrain that blocked or covered avenues of advance. Prior to 1942, the main battle position comprised mutually supporting platoon positions. Each company deployed to platoons forward and one in reserve. The reserve company of each battalion was similarly deployed to provide depth to the position. Light, Machine guns were deployed forward with riflemen, while heavy machine guns could be placed well forward, often slightly to the rear, covering gaps between units, possible enemy attack positions, and the flanks. Anti-armor. Rifles and light mortars 5 centimeters were located within the platoon positions to allow the gunners direct observation of targets. Heavy mortars 8 centimeters were placed on reverse slopes, as were infantry guns. Anti-armor guns were usually to the rear of forward positions and covering avenues of armor advance. Some anti-armor guns were placed in forward positions, though. Mines were laid, and obstacles constructed to the extent allowed by limits of time and material. These could be continuous belts laid in depth in well-developed positions. A division with 3 battalion regiments would normally have two regiments in the main battle position with a total of 4 battalions forward. This meant that 8 of the division's 27 rifle companies were in the division's main battle line, each with 2 platoons forward. To all intents and purposes, the reserve platoons were in the battle line, as they were within sight of the forward platoons, and supported them with direct fire. This meant that 24 of the division's 81 platoons were on the 6,000 to 10,000 meters front line. The combat outpost position was manned by the forward regiment's reserve battalion, and the advanced position, if established, was manned by detachments from the reserve regiment, reconnaissance, and tank troops. The strong point concept. December 1941. In December 1941, the Germans adopted a new defensive concept to deal with. It's the desperate situation on the Eastern Front. The initial plan for the winter of 1941-42 was to drive the Red Army towards the Ural Mountains, seize the main population and industrial centers, and withdraw 2/3 of the German forces, leaving the rest to establish a line of strong points to defend the Third Reich's new frontier. The strong point defense was an economy of force effort. To employ the smallest possible number of troops to cover the widest possible front. German losses had been tremendous, and replacements could not be trained fast enough. Understrength units could not man the required wide fronts in the traditional manner, a near-continuous linear defense. On 16 December, Hitler issued his no-retreat order, putting a halt to local withdrawals. Then underway as units sought more easily defendable terrain in which to sit. The official term for a strong point was Stützpunkt, but Hitler preferred hedgehog position. A Gelstellungsstützpunkt generally remained in use in official publications, though. The no-retreat order denied commanders a proven, effective countermeasure to massed Soviet attacks. Regardless of the order, it was still carried out in some instances. When a Soviet attack was imminent, the forward troops were pulled back prior to the artillery barrages striking the strongpoints. Depending on the terrain, a withdrawal of 800 to 2,000 meters back to second line positions was all that was required. The barrages fell on empty positions and obstacles, as Russian infantrymen rushed forward supported by tanks. The Germans would then open fire with artillery, mortars, and machine guns from long range, and wait for the assault's momentum to slow, formations to become disorganized and disorientated, and then to either withdraw or stumble piecemeal into the prepared defenses. The forward positions could usually be reoccupied following German counterattacks. Army Group Center had successfully employed the elastic defense in August and September, but by December, German units were so severely under strength that such a defense could not be established other than as a thin screen. Sufficient troops were simply not available to man the multiple zone in depth defense over such broad fronts, and the necessary mobile reserves did not exist. Panzer divisions fielded only a dozen tanks, and the remaining crews were serving as infantrymen. Rear service units were stripped to provide infantry replacements. Infantry battalions were at less than company strength, and companies had 25 to 70 men. The infantry strength of entire corps was less than 2,000 troops, with a 250-man battalion deemed well manned. Many units possessed only a quarter of their heavy weapons. Rather than the doctrinal, a rifle platoon in defensive position early war, An early war rifle platoon Suk defensive position is depicted here with all three squads group labeled A, B, and C deployed on line. 19 Toman rifle, positions 1 are used. It was intended that the squad light machine guns too be positioned to cover the entire platoon front without gaps, but this was not always possible. Alternate machine gun positions may have been prepared to cover gaps as well as the flanks and the gaps between adjacent platoons. Time permitting, some scattered rifle and 1 or 2 light machine gun positions may have been dug in the rear and oriented in that direction. 3. On this type of terrain, the positions were typically at 10 meters intervals, less in densely wooded terrain. In some exceptional circumstances, 1 squad may have been deployed to the rear, oriented forward to provide depth to the position. If the platoon had 4 squads, 1 would normally be deployed in the rear. The platoon's 5 centimeters light mortar 4 is positioned to the rear, but in a place where it could observe its target area, as it had no observers. A 3.7 centimeters anti-armor gun 5 and 2 heavy machine gun squad 6 have been attached. 2. The platoon, along with an anti-armor rifle troop 7. The forward perimeter and flanks are protected by a double-apron barbed wire fence, a Flanders fence. 8. Some 30 to 50 meters from the positions, keeping the troops beyond hand grenade range. Sods of earth for camouflaging. Positions have been removed in the rear from beneath trees and brush. 9. The Zug for her S. Sure. End. Zug. Truppführer's 11 positions are also indicated. N. Observation or listening post 12 is located to the front of the platoon, beyond the wire fence. The large red arrow. Find words indicates the direction towards the enemy. 6 to 10 kilometer sectors. The hollow divisions were assigned 30 to 60 kilometers fronts against the unexpected Soviet counteroffensive. All 3 regiments had to be placed in the main battle line, with often all 9 battalions as well, allowing no regimental reserves other than the battalion's reserve companies, which were also manning deeper strongpoints. The Germans called it putting everything in the shop window. Scattered squad SAM platoons would be held in reserve by battalions and companies to conduct immediate local counterattacks. An understrength reconnaissance battalion served as the division's only mobile reserve, although if possible divisions contained 1 infantry battalion in reserve. To Maka matters worse, the strained German logistics system was on the verge of collapse. Understrength companies might organize into 2 platoons with 3 6 2 10-man squads, each with a machine gun and positioned in, quote, a cluster of 3 to 5 2-man firing positions. Additional machine guns are often provided from service units as a substitute for riflemen. Remaining 5 centimeters mortars were concentrated 50 meters to the rear under company control. Anti-armor guns were held in the rear to deal with tank breakthroughs. In some instances, anti-armor guns were placed in strong points, making few available to block breakthroughs in their rear. Strong points were established around villages to control roads and provide shelter from the brutal weather till fighting positions and bunkers could be built. Other strong points were built on the little available high ground. Weapons were positioned to target the enemy at maximum range, provide mutual support to adjacent strong points, and cover the gaps between strong points. The little remaining artillery was positioned further forward than normal, increasing the danger of it being overrun, to cover the different strong points. Many divisions fielded only an understrength artillery battalion, rather than 4, causing the few batteries to be widely dispersed to cover all the strong points. This prevented artillery fire from being concentrated en masse on main attacks, as not all batteries could range the wide division front. Mortar were distributed among strong points rather than being concentrated behind the forward units, meaning they were unable to range all the strong points. They could usually cover adjacent strong points though. Light air defense units positioned their 2 centimeters flak guns in strongpoints, which proved ideal for breaking up mass infantry attacks. The strongpoint defense remained into mid-1943, 1944 in some areas. After that, the Germans were in steady retreat. Defenses consisted of hastily established lines in scattered sectors without continuous front lines, little at depth, and few, if any, reserves. As relentless Allied assaults hammered at the Germans on all fronts, time and resources rarely allowed anything close to a doctrinal defense to be established. Pioneer units often built defensive positions and obstacles to await withdrawing infantry. Defenses were built on rivers to provide major obstacles. Villages and towns were turned into strongpoints and cities into fortresses, festing, essentially a propaganda title. Some of these, though, were well defended, with multiple rings of strongpoints, protected by anti-armor ditches and minefields. In-depth defenses were prepared on the roads leading into the fortress city. Switch positions were constructed between the fortified lines to protect against breakthroughs. Hedgerow defenses, Normandy 1944. In Normandy, the Germans encountered a compartmented maze of cultivated fields, orchards, and pastures atop the Collines de Normandy Plateau 1015. Kilometers inland, the Bocage country. These fields were separated by earth and rock berms 0.5 to 1.5 meters thick and up to 1.5 meters high. They were topped with dense hedges and small trees from 1 meter to 5 meters in height. Ditch-lined roads and wagon tracks, often sunken, ran throughout the area, bounded on both sides by hedgerows with small gated openings into the fields. The enclosed fields scowled be relatively small, up to a few 100 meters to a side. They could be square, rectangular, or triangular, and were laid out in irregular patterns. The Germans dug weapon positions and rifleman holes, often with an attached dugout, into the hedgerows, as well as dugouts and positions for command posts, telephone exchanges, ammunition points, medical stations, and others. Well camouflaged, they were difficult to detect from the ground or air. Observation between fields was impossible, and an attacking force had an idea what was behind the next or adjacent hedgerows. The only way to approach a hedgerow was by crossing the open fields. The Germans would die-edge positions along the far side of the hedgerow and those on the flanks in the defended sectors. There were no continuous straight lines consisting more of a checkerboard pattern. Allied tactics evolved with alternating fields, attacked with tank support while mortars and artillery suppressed the intervening fields' hedgerows. Hedgerow cutter plows were fabricated for attachment to tanks, allowing them to burst through the berms. The compartmented nature of the hedgerows allowed the Germans to break contact easily, though, and withdraw to the next hedgerow. Left defense of a village, Northwest Europe. Villages were extremely irregular in pattern and layout, making the organization of the defense, the selection of ST points, the positioning of crew-served weapons, and placement of obstacles as difficult for the defender to determinous for the attacker to predict. There were endless possibilities. Light defenses and observation posts were positioned on the village's outskirts. In this example, significant anti-armor defenses are positioned on theater edge to the left to blunt an expected tank
penetration.
These anti-armor guns would have alternate positions deeper in the village. Most strongpoints are located well within the village, and machine gunners and snipers, in reality selected riflemen, are scattered through the village to disrupt and delay the attackers. Mortar and infantry guns are positioned to fire on all main approaches, and they too have alternate positions in the event of the attacker approaching them. The strongpoints consist of interconnected, defended groups of barricaded buildings, with concealed firing positions, reinforced cellars, and mouse holes connecting buildings. Two of the main roads through the village are left unblocked to allow attacking tanks to enter killing zones within the village. Anti-armor guns repositioned from the outer defense line to the left. We'll cover these. The reserve platoon is located at a strong points are shown, enclosed within red lines. Defensive firepower. The infantry regiment The German infantry regiment was a well-structured unit with a complete range of support weapons allocated to all subunits. The types of automatic weapons, mortars, and infantry guns were well balanced. The main flaw was inadequate anti-armor weapons, but attempts were made to improve them. Through the war, with one minor exception, the subunits at all levels were organized in triangular form, and most support weapons were allocated so as to provide one weapon or a pair of weapons to each subordinate unit. While the German army was oriented towards mobile, offensive warfare, the infantry regiments, comprising the bulk of the combat power, still went largely by foot, with only small numbers of trucks and numerous horse-drawn wagons and carts to haul supplies and equipment. There were numerous types of infantry regiments, including mountain light infantry, motorized infantry, and occupation or static troops. They were based on the same structure as the following standard 1939 infantry regiment, the basic common organization. There were exceptions, depending on when the regiment was raised, including minor changes in weapons allocation, substitution of certain weapons by others, and slight differences of subunit. The later two battalion regiments mirrored this basic structure. Strengths are approximate, since units were habitually undermanned, thus rendering the authorized strength virtually meaningless. The 3,250-man infantry regiment consisted of a staff section with mounted on horseback, but soon replaced by bicycles, pioneer, and signal platoons. Zug, a light infantry column, light infantry colonne, supplies, ammunition, baggage, transport. I-3 infantry battalions, bataillon, and infantry gun and armor defense companies company. The 850-man battalions possessed a staff section with signal platoon and trains, TROs, 3 rifle companies, and a machine gun company. The companies were numbered in sequence through the regiment. I 1st, 4th companies, 2, 5th, 8th, and 3, 9th, 12th. The 4th, 8th, and 12th companies were machine gun armed. The machine gun company Maschinengewehr company had a company troop. Company Trupp company headquarters, 3 heavy machine gun platoons, and a heavy mortar platoon. The machine gun platoons had 3 squads each of 2 troops, with each manning a 7.92 mm MG38 tripod-mounted machine gun, for a total of 12 guns. The mortar platoon had 3 squads, each with 2 troops, for a total of 6.8 cm S.Gr.W.34. English language publications refer to machine, gun, and mortar squads, Grupp and troops, Trupp, sections and squads, respectively, as they would be termed in a U.S. organization. The E.by Joe Sherman rifle Schutzen companies had a company troop and trains combat, rations, baggage, 3 rifle platoons, plus an anti-armor rifle squad. The 48-man rifle platoons had a platoon leader, an NCO troop leader equivalent to a platoon sergeant, 2 messengers, and a medical orderly in the platoon. Troop, Suk troop. The platoon had a 3-man light mortar troop with a 5 cm La. Gr.W.36 mortar intended to engage machine gun nests and small groups of infantrymen. There were initially 4 10-man squads with a squad leader, troop leader, assistant squad leader, machine gunner, his assistant, and ammunition man, and 5 riflemen. The 3-man MG-34 light machine gun troops operated under the squad leader's control. The riflemen operated as the rifle troop under the direct control of the troop leader. The squad leader had a 9mm MP38 or MP40 machine pistol, the machine gunner a 9mm P08 Luger or P38 Walther pistol, while all the others had 7.92mm Kar, 98K Mauser. 1 rifleman had a rifle grenade launcher, and 2 hand grenades were carried by most men. Machine guns, a brief discussion of light and heavy machine guns is in order. The MG-34 and later MG-42 machine guns served in many. In German practice, the terms light and heavy define the machine gun's role, not its weight. In the light machine gun role, the weapon was used on its bipod or fired from the hip or shoulder. It provided half the rifle squad's Firepower and the squad's maneuver tactics and defense were centered on the gun. The three-man troop carried one spare barrel. In the heavy machine gun, the weapon was manned by a six-man troop, mounted on a tripod, provided with a long-range optical sight, and had three spare barrels to provide, supporting long-range overhead and flanking fire. The company's seven-man anti-armor rifle squad had three 7.92 mm PZ, Bead and Senjo, Panzerbuch, anti-armor rifles. By 1941, this weapon was obsolete, but remained in limited use for a time. It used a 7.92x 94 mm cartridge, much larger than the 7.92x 57 mm used in carbines and machine guns. The second number indicates the case length. Other models were used, including captured weapons,